Hey everyone, and welcome back to another World of Warcraft video. Last time in this series we covered the launch of Cataclysm. A lot of hype and then, one of the toughest situations Blizzard ever found themselves in. But they did have a plan, and it was time to bring back an old enemy. First though, today's video is made possible by Audible. Audible have a massive library of audiobooks, including many of the recent World of Warcraft tie-in books like Illidan, Warcrimes, Stormrage, and Proudmoore. They're all on there, and, excitingly, Before the Storm is coming out in under a month. So if you sign up for a free trial with my link, not only will you help out the channel a great deal in these turbulent times on YouTube, but you'll also get a free audiobook of choice. The book's yours for life, even if you cancel, so there's no risk. They're pretty much just giving you a free book of your choosing and hoping you like the service, and you can still use that credit. You can just hold on to it and use it for Before the Storm if you want. Patch 4.1 brought us 2 new dungeons, remastered versions of Zul'Gurub and Zalaman. The dungeons were actually great. The bosses had solid and sometimes at times really interesting mechanics, but the quality of this patch's content wasn't the problem. The problem was the broad state of Cataclysm. It had been out for months, and the dungeoning experience was still troubled. The loss of ICC had cut many players and guilds off from raiding, which led to the social bonds that hold the very game together just being weaker. This was just 2 new dungeons, plus there was the perception that, 2 more remasters. People thought it was low effort, and I can't say that bothered me too much, but yeah, it's one of those perception things that Blizzard had to deal with, and past that there was still a massive problem. These dungeons were technically in a new tier, they were harder, they had better rewards, which is exciting, but it meant that where players had previously been doing many dungeons, they were now funneled into just 2. Now, as good as these dungeons were, that just isn't sustainable. This patch also did bring a rather large change to Valor points, so instead of having just a daily cap, you actually had a weekly cap, which basically gave players more freedom in when they played the game, and that's a theme that has carried forward to today. This often meant that players would essentially get together maybe once a week, blast through like 7 or 8 dungeons to efficiently grind out their VP. 4.1 also brought the Call to Arms dungeon queue system, plus a new guild finder, which is really not that widely used. So while 4.1 did have some good elements, it had a few problems, and really it was a shot in the arm, nothing more. 4.2 did hit the test realm shortly after 4.1's release, which at least gave players something to look forward to. WoW's next subscriber report came through during the 4.2 testing period, and it brought something that many of us expected. Yup, subscriber losses. We were down to 11.1 million. Now, according to Blizzard, this is because they basically realized players consumed the endgame content faster than the devs anticipated, and they promised to fix this problem, more frequent patches and more frequent expansions, which is a nod towards their disastrous yearly expansion plan. Alright, let's talk about patch 4.2. But we kind of have to talk about what it was not first. So Blizzard originally planned to deliver 2 different raids. There was going to be one themed around fire and one around water. So Firelands, which we got, and Abyssal Maw, which we did not. The Abyssal Maw itself was supposed to follow on from the storyline of Vashj'ir, perhaps even more directly hinting at N'Zoth, but it was not to be. Ghostcrawler would later reveal that the Abyssal Maw raid was really appealing to the devs because they just had a bunch of Vashj'ir assets lying around, but as time went on they realized it's just 3 bosses with reused art and it did not compete in quality with the Firelands. Now, Firelands, it had so much love and care put into it with loads of unique art, so having it stand alongside a lower quality, we just did it because it was cheap, raid, that just wasn't acceptable to the team. Development is hard, and sometimes you do just need to cut stuff. As for the Firelands itself, well, by all accounts, it was a hell of a raid. It had loads of unique feeling bosses, and it had a rock-hard ending with Ragnaros, who, along with his new set of legs, provided a massive challenge for top-end raid guilds. But still, it was an entire tier that was only 7 bosses long, which is a bit of a decrease from the previous one. Thankfully though, the new art assets were not just confined to the raid. This patch did bring a large amount of world content, which is something that the Cataclysm had sort of been lacking. We actually had 2 new daily quest areas, the Regrowth and the Molten Front. There we would basically be helping the druids protect Mount Hyjal and strike back against Ragnaros. And the main innovation here is you personally progress through the Molten Front. So doing the daily quests would give you rep with a new faction, and then getting enough rep would lead to more quests unlocking, and those quests would unlock more of the area. So this gave you this tangible sense of progression, and importantly, it meant that you had something to do on your character outside of raiding or going through those same two Rise of the Pandaria dungeons. Or maybe PvP or something like that, because of course by this time the 4.0 reputations, they were pretty much long gone. Now, story-focused players actually had even more content here with the Thrall questline. It wasn't remarkable, to be honest, and it was the precursor of something that people really didn't like, Green Jesus, but we'll get onto that in a bit. Blizzard also did add the first new legendary to the game since Shadowmourne. Dragonwrath was quite similar to Shadowmourne in that it involved a mixture of story content and then farming up raid materials. A very different legendary style from what we got in Legion, where the idea was that essentially you'd prioritize which guild member would get it depending on their usefulness to the raid. This therefore was quite cool for some, but for others was definitely the source of quite a few guild dramas. There were of course many other changes and tweaks. We got the Dungeon Journal, which is a new feature that's persisted to this day, but overall, was this a successful patch? Well, I think it kind of depends what metric you use. Design-wise, I think this had a great raid and a really strong attempt at world content, with the broad strokes designs of, say, the Molten Front persisting long past the relevance of this patch. It does feel like kind of an early template for a modern patch. New world content, new entry to a serialized story, as well as a new raid and systems changes. Numerically, though, it was a little bit rough. Subscriber numbers were continuing to fall, reaching 10.3 million just 3 months after the Firelands released. And during that 10.3 million earnings call, Blizzard teased 4.3, supposedly the largest patch ever for the game. And the contents of this patch were expanded upon in the following BlizzCon. But that's not really what people were talking about. No, people were talking about Mists of Pandaria because it was announced, people were confused. To them, it did not feel like Warcraft, it did not really look like what Warcraft traditionally looked like. It was just a bit too much for many, and that led to a very, very mixed response. This is something that Blizzard later would go on to say that they didn't really anticipate, and indeed, Mists of Pandaria turned out, for its first half, to be a real winner. The raids were fantastic, the story was actually pretty great once you started paying attention to it, and they had a steady stream of content that at times rivaled Legion. But still, at this stage, people just saw strange pandas. So people were feeling uneasy about the future direction of the game with MoP. They were already a bit suspicious about just Cataclysm itself, which meant that as we were going into 4.3, the community wasn't really in the best spot. Patch 4.3 was a troubled patch that was arguably quite a bit below the quality of 4.2. First, it seemed like a major piece of content was either reworked or cancelled. You see, in the Cataclysm press event of June 2010, Blizzard talked about a planned War of the Ancients raid. Well, at some point that plan changed, with the War of the Ancients being turned into a single 5-player dungeon. And, I wouldn't be hard on this sort of point normally, but when you look at the Dragon Soul, it's clear that something went wrong. So with the Dragon Soul, it is almost entirely comprised of art assets that already existed. It's unlike these new and fresh feeling of, say, the Firelands raid. And then when we look at the other two dungeons, again, they're both just taking place around Wyrmrest Temple, both pretty much using all existing assets. These, in my view, are telltale signs of troubled development. Unfortunately, Dragon Soul as a raid was probably one of the least popular ever. Its difficulty in the non-heroic mode was heavily criticized, with many guilds clearing it very, very quickly. Now, I think this is kind of understandable, maybe a reaction to falling raid participation rates that resulted from the culling of the old ICC 10 style difficulty level that was quite friendly to social guilds. But of course, as you went into the heroic modes, it still was a challenge. But for me, what was more disappointing, I think, is just the general layout of the raid and its look and its feel. The bosses weren't really that cool. The locations were all just stuff we'd seen before. Now, if you compare that to the Throne of Thunder or a raid like Siege of Orgrimmar, or maybe more modern examples such as all of Warlords and all of Legion, well, imagine if a Battle for Azeroth raid comprised of almost entirely reused Legion assets. I don't think people would be particularly pleased. Now, another controversial topic was the introduction of LFR. This seems to have been another reaction to falling raid participation rates. And the early version of LFR, it was really rough in comparison to what we have now, but it did do its job. Players could, queue and see a raid. Was it good for the game overall? I actually suspect it wasn't. 2 years later, lead systems designer Ghostcrawler would say that LFR is a system that has aspects that he regrets, and that the new flexible raid system that was introduced with Siege of Orgrimmar really is a better solution to the same problem. Now, we're not done with Dragon Soul yet, though, because it is time to talk about Deathwing. Perhaps the worst expansion end boss ever? I mean, wow. Blizzard were presented with a problem. Deathwing is bloody massive, so how do you have players fight something that's so large? Well, there was a data-mined human model of Deathwing, but you can kind of understand why we wouldn't just want, Deathwing to turn into a dude when we go to fight him. No, instead what happened is we'd scratched his back, and then Thrall did a Dragon Ball, and then Deathwing turned into a strange tentacle monster, and then we killed the strange tentacle monster. At no point did we really fight Deathwing in the form that he was famous for. The spine of Deathwing was a trash fight, and the final encounter, it didn't really feel like you were facing down a true villain at all. He was a pitiful disgrace of a creature at that point. It wasn't something that was tall and proud like Arthas or Kil'jaeden, even though Kil'jaeden, we did find him in a bit of a compromising situation, let's just say. And then it didn't really help that Thrall took center stage for much of this raid, and this, in combination with his previous plot, just led to a character that was really annoying, and that made him an easy fall guy for the community to meme after the fact. Now, one high point of this patch that we should quickly mention is the dungeon content. We got 3 new dungeons, with War of the Ancients probably being the standout one, which seems to make sense because maybe it was supposed to be raid content, hard to know. But these function much like the 4.1 dungeons. They were in a higher tier difficulty, it made them super popular, and I think they definitely were good for the game. However, there was a bit of an odd thing. Unlike 4.2, there was little in the way of world content, which is something that's kind of unthinkable today. And we also did get some other things like, say, Fangs of the Father, that legendary quest line, which is more notable because it involved us working with Rathian, who of course we had saved as an egg back in the Blasted Lands questing revamp. Now, this patch, of course, did bring in another massive system. This is maybe its main legacy, Transmogrification. This was massive because it had the effect of essentially unlocking a tremendous amount of content. Players now had a reward structure in place for soloing old dungeon and raid content. And really, I'd say that few systems have created as much gameplay in one move as this system did, and I've got to imagine that the twilight year of Cataclysm would have been far worse without it. There were detractors, though, with some valid points about, what it kind of says about eroding character identity by basically making it not be that what you see is what you get. Finally, this patch did add the first version of the new Darkmoon Island. Not a massive shakeup, but hey, it was kind of welcome. Subscribers would continue to fall over the next year, and PvP players were also hit pretty damn hard, with the Dragon Soul season being just ludicrously long. December 2011 saw minor losses, taking the game down to 10.2 million, but the shocking numbers came for July of 2012, where the game was down to 9.1 million. Yep, that's a loss of 1.1 million, which is kind of massive. So what is the legacy of Cataclysm? Well, in short, it's complicated. Dungeons probably had the toughest time, and the experience of Cataclysm led to Blizzard just abandoning patch dungeons as a concept for years. Now, when a new raid comes out, it replaces the previous raid, so you lose a raid, but you gain a raid. Well, with new dungeons, when they come out at a higher tier of reward, you get maybe 2 or 3 new dungeons, which is great, but then you've just thrown all the other ones in the bin because they feel like a waste of time. Plus, you then funnel all your players through the same 2 dungeons, which leads to burnout. It seems like this didn't work out great for Blizzard, so they pretty much stopped doing patch dungeons until Legion. Now, while Cataclysm did doom the role of dungeons for years, it inadvertently led to their revival. So Blizzard knew how good the launch heroics were for Gilded players. They knew they were really fun bits of content, and that led to them building challenge modes for Mists of Pandaria. They of course stayed in WoD, and the challenge modes eventually morphed into the Mythic Plus system of Legion, which I think you can argue is one of the best features to be added to the game ever. And then we can further trace, say, the launch heroics of Cataclysm back to the trio of ICC dungeons, especially Halls of Reflection, and then if you go even further back, you look at, say, the Rockhard heroics of early Burning Crusade. It's a pretty interesting timeline, like the role of dungeons, and it kind of paints a picture of development that was maybe a bit too reactive, causing the role of a dungeon to ping-pong about the place until Legion, where they seem to have finally found a strong identity for the dungeon format. Next, the raiding situation, which was odd. So in Wrath, you had ICC 10 normal and heroic, and then you had ICC 25 normal and heroic. They were 4 different difficulty modes in that system, with ICC 10 being on par with today's normal mode raids. Cataclysm just had 10 and 25 normal and heroic, which were 2 difficulty modes, both of which were significantly above the difficulty of an ICC 10-like thing. And it would not be until Siege of Orgrimmar with the Flex system that Blizzard would offer a similar spread of raid content, to what made Wrath of the Lich King so successful with ICC 10, and that's 4 years. Now, LFR was supposed to fill the gap left by ICC 10, but it was just a different kettle of fish. It's not something that appealed to the core ICC audience, who still wanted pre-made group content. So in short, Blizzard deleted one of their largest modes of play, and they kept it dead for 4 years. Next, Path of the Titans. This didn't even make it into Cataclysm, but you really can see its effects today. Legion artifacts are designed to fulfill the same goal, giving players progression at endgame that is not directly based on their item level. And when you look at Battle of Azeroth's Heart of Azeroth system, again, we're seeing a continuation of that idea. And then when we look at world content, it's pretty clear that Blizzard liked the Molten Front. Mists of Pandaria reps, as an example, were designed in a similar manner, with content unlocking as you gained reputation, and a lot of its format served as a template for things like Krasarang Wilds in patch 5.1, or the Isle of Thunder content, especially with how the zone itself expanded as you got the reputation. I think, if anything, a part of this expansion's legacy is that it set the game up for a strange future. Mists of Pandaria ended up having a year of great content, really well-paced updates that rivaled the Legion patch cycle, but it had a divisive theme, and it was then followed up by a tremendously just disaster of an expansion with Warlords. All of the time here, the team was trying to struggle to hit yearly expansions, which, every time they did try that, they fell flat in their faces with a massive content drought. Now, I was able to end the Mists of Pandaria retrospective on a pretty happy note. It was an underdog story. It was the expansion that had terrible launch, big issues, but eventually it stemmed the tide of departing players, and it even managed to reverse it. With Cataclysm, the best we can do is trace changes forward, past 2 expansions, and talk about how some things, like the desire for endgame non-gear-based progression and, say, hard dungeons, how those things beneficially did come full circle for the team, but it was a really long, twisty road to get there because of the issues that Mists of Pandaria and Warlords of Draenor both faced. Really, to me, it seems like Cataclysm was in some ways trying to shore up the learnings that they had from Wrath and create a new baseline like template for a WoW expansion. Of course, they didn't. The next 2 expansions were very troublesome, and it's only really with Legion that they, I think, now have that template of what a WoW expansion is. And when you look at Battle for Azeroth, it pretty much is just taking the Legion template and carrying it forward. So it seems like the team finally has got to where they want to be. So that's it for this series. I hope you've enjoyed it, and a massive thank you to Audible for supporting it. You can get your free audiobook by following the link down in the description, and I would probably go for War Crimes as your free book, or I'd maybe sit on that free book credit until the launch of Before the Storm, and you can pretty much pick that up on launch day, which is what I'm going to be doing myself. But yeah, thank you to Audible for supporting this series. Thank you to you for watching. I'm really keen to hear what you've got to say down in the comments about this expansion, especially if you sort of lived through it. And yeah, with all that, guys, I will see you next time.